Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Naturescaping Site Planning and Design virtual workshop. My name is Andrew Felton. I work with the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District, and I am joined tonight by Laura Price. Good evening, Laura. How are you?
I'm doing just fine, thanks.
Great. So today we're going to be exploring how you can put together a site design plan for any naturescaping project. Just to quickly go over what this evening will look like, I'm going to give a brief introduction on the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District and conservation districts in general. Then I'll hand it over to Laura so that she'll give part one of her presentation. After that part one, we'll have a very brief intermission and a quick Q&A session, just so folks can get up and use the restroom and we can answer a quick question or two. And then Laura will finish part two of her presentation. At the very end, we'll have time for a Q&A. Laura has been gracious enough to be willing to stay a little bit after in case we do have lots of questions along the way. We'll do so. Just to go through a couple of housekeeping items, we are recording tonight's webinar and we will be posting it on the district's YouTube channel at some point this week. And I will be sending out a follow-up email that will contain a link to that webinar, that recording, as well as some additional follow-up resources that might help you along the way as you're putting together any sort of naturescaping project. At the end, when you log out of the workshop, a survey will pop directly up. If you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to complete that for us, it is a great help in helping us develop these workshops and webinars. We will be holding a random drawing for one person who completes the survey, and they'll receive a gift certificate to a local native plant nursery in Washington County. If you wouldn't mind switching over to the next slide, Laura.
Whoops.
Great. So as I mentioned, I work for the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. The primary function of conservation districts is to work with residents in the county to help protect our natural resources like water, soil, and habitat. Conservation districts are a form of local government. Usually we receive our funding through tax levies or through grants from the federal or state governments. We like to say that we primarily work with our community in three different forms, and that's to provide technical assistance such as advice, planning support, financial assistance through grants or cost share programs, and through education through workshops just like this one that you're attending. Our district, the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District, is based in Washington County, which is just right outside of the Portland area. By land use, our district is made up of about 15% urban, 35% rural, and about 50% forest land usage. And with each one of those land uses comes a different conservation issue, or but at the same time, all of them affect the watershed at a whole. So we like to say that we provide conservation, or we try to enable conservation at a watershed level for just that reason. If you wouldn't mind switching it to the next slide. Now, just to give you a quick background on soil and water conservation districts, because many people haven't heard of them before. Conservation districts were born out of the 1930s when the United States experienced what a natural disaster was known as the Dust Bowl. Leading up to the Dust Bowl, farmers spent many years heavy plowing their lands, and that removed many deep-rooted plants that enabled soil just to turn to dust and sit on top of the ground. Now, after a large drought, large winds picked up and that dust took to the sky and created what's known as black blizzards that really enveloped the entire middle and eastern United States. And in response to this, the federal government set up what was known as the Soil Conservation Service. Today, that's known as the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And that was really used to help landowners care for the land in a more sustainable way. In 1937, it was recognized that conservation would be better at a local scale rather than holding it with the federal government. And from that, these localized soil and water conservation districts were formed. And they decided to do that because local entities have a better understanding of the climates, of the soils that they're dealing with, And so it just enabled better conservation to be enacted. Today, conservation districts exist in almost every county in the United States. If you don't live in Washington County and you're not within the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District, I really encourage you to look up your local conservation district, and they can help provide resources that might help you enable some of these conservation practices that we'll be talking about today. Next slide, please. Another bit of context that we like to provide is what a watershed is. A watershed is a drainage basin that all the water that falls onto it or runs under it all goes to the same place. I always like to think of watersheds as a bathtub. All the water drains from one end all the way down to the lowest point, and that's exactly what a watershed is. It's typically defined by the shape of a land, by land, the mountains, the valleys, you name it. And we like to say that we do conservation at a watershed scale because all the water is connected within a watershed. And because of that, all of the natural resource issues that we face are all also connected. One of the most important things to remember is that we all live in a watershed and we all impact it. So those everyday actions that we can take all have a positive or negative impact on our watershed. Next slide, please. Now, how does naturescaping fit into watersheds? Which is a really great question. Naturescaping is all about putting native plants in place, and native plants are essential for a healthy watershed. Native plants help have very deep root systems, more so than invasive plants, and that helps control erosion, as well as it allows us to have better water quality because it helps filter that water as it's moving through a watershed. Native plants also provide better habitat for wildlife, so you can have more habitat and more biodiversity throughout watersheds if you have native plants. And likewise, native plants don't need as many pesticides or fertilizers. And with those, oftentimes comes a lot of pollution issues. So native plants, because they don't require those, often lead to healthier watersheds. Now I'm going to hand it off to Laura, but I forgot one thing. Throughout the presentation, as I mentioned, we will have time for a Q&A. If you, on the bottom of your screen or the top if you're on a map, there'll be a little Q&A icon. Feel free to go ahead and start populating that with any questions that you might have, and we'll be able to answer those in the order that they come in when those Q&A sections come on. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to Laura.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. And hello, everybody. I really enjoy sharing this naturescaping. It's a little bit of my soapbox, but I just get so excited about the transformation that you can make and the rewards that you can see and feel from that. So let's continue. Once I get this little, okay. So I'd like to start just by reiterating the purpose of this workshop. I'm guessing that many of you have had some introduction to naturescaping, either through the workshop that Tualatin Soil and Water District has provided, or perhaps on the link that Andrew provided you. So the purpose of this workshop is really to build on that, and it's tended to kind of give you the tools and process to plan, visualize, and create a garden plan that helps you achieve your goals, both with respect to naturescaping and just to enjoy your outdoor living space. So some people might ask, why make a plan? Do we really need to do that? You know, and whoops, I'll have to get more careful with my jumpy finger. A scale plan helps you organize all of the spaces and activities that you want to have in your yard in a cohesive way. So it helps to go through that process. And it helps you locate those site features in a way that best fits your site conditions. And we'll walk through a site analysis or assessment process to do that. Provides you an overall vision or a game plan that then helps you prioritize or kind of phase the projects you do. I know in workshops that I've taught, participants often get really excited and appreciate all that goes into it, and then sometimes feel a little overwhelmed about how you bring that all together. So this should help you with that. And then finally, it enables you to actually figure out plant and material quantities that you need, because it is to scale. So you know how many plants will really fit in an area. And you know, you can look at a pathway, for example, and calculate the square footage and the depth of mulch or gravel that you're using. And from there, actually calculate, well, how many cubic yards do I need to purchase? So it's good for all those reasons. And this is just simply kind of a reiteration or a review of naturescaping, kind of pulling it all together under one description. So I like to say it's the practice of creating and caring for your landscape that includes, of course, native plants. And you're providing wildlife habitat in as many ways as possible, protecting and building healthy living soils, conserving water use, optimizing the stormwater that you receive on your site, and avoiding chemical pollutants. And all of this you can do without sacrificing splendor. We hope, you know, we can show and convince you of that through this presentation. And ideally, it's also reducing costs and maintenance for you. So Andrew talked about some of this, but again, just a brief review. The reason that native plants are really the backbone of our naturescaping gardens and yards is that they're adapted to our soil. They're native, they were always here. So they're used to the generally more clay soils that we find here in the Willamette Valley. And they also tend to be naturally more acidic due to our climate and rains that leach some of the calciums and magnesiums that would neutralize the pH the other direction. But probably, I think most importantly, they're adapted to our climate, which has a wet season and a dry season, which means they do need to tolerate at times of your really soggy, saturated soils, and at the same time be fine with 100 days of no rain, which we've seen for the past 3 summers. Because they're native, they're more resilient and they're less susceptible to common garden pests and diseases, which is one of our biggest arguments for not needing any chemical or pesticides or fertilizers to garden with. And also because they've been here forever, they've evolved along with our birds and bees and butterflies and other insects. And so our wildlife actually recognizes and is drawn to our native plants, in many cases more so than some of the ornamental varieties that have been created for our human eyes. But I had one professor always tell me that there's no free lunch in nature and there's always trade-offs. And some of these non-native varieties really don't have the same draw to our pollinators and birds. And all of this adds up to being more low maintenance because they are resilient. Again, this is a little bit of a quick review on naturescaping design principles or elements. But I like this slide because it sort of pulls the whole of all of the elements of what you do in a more nature-focused or nature-inspired yard. So again, yeah, we all know we include native plants, but also look for alternatives to lawn and grass. That meaning you can just lessen it, reduce it, remove it altogether, or replace it with other similar ground covers that give you kind of the same visual effect without having the high input needs that a lawn does in terms of fertilizers and watering and maintenance and all of that. You know, creating wild habitat is just kind of at the core of naturescaping. And this means not just plants with berries or blooms, but also shelter and water sources and habitat for different creatures. You know, we have lizards and newts and snakes that will benefit from features that you include in the yard for them to harbor and shelter. Vegetation layering is a concept we use that really mimics nature, where you have upper stories and understories, large shrubs, medium, right on down to the ground floor, where you'll see some of your grasses and perennials and ground covers. Water conservation is increasingly important with our climate change. And there's a way, yes, you can do that by having drought tolerant plants, but you can also conserve water by your watering methods, by how much you amend the soil with compost and protect it with mulch. And so there's lots of ways to minimize the amount of water you need to use. Soil building and protection, which we will touch on, and also utilizing the rainwater so that it's not causing problems like erosion or running off into the street. It's really a resource that you want to use and keep on your property to replenish the groundwater in your soils that will help sustain your yard and garden through the summers. And then last but not least is think about how you can plant to reduce energy needs. What comes to mind obviously is a shady tree on your south-facing side or west-facing side to provide some cooling shade in the summer and while keeping the sun in the winter. Or a windbreak, perhaps, if you have strong prevailing winds. Oops. Excuse me, some things I have to. There we go. Nope. I'm sorry. What's happening here?
You might just have to click on your presentation again and then.
I'm doing that, but okay.
There we go.
My apologies for that. So where do we get started? We like to suggest that you look up your property on various GIS maps online. There's several sources, almost every jurisdiction offers them. Portland Maps, if you are within those boundaries, probably more likely Washington County Maps will provide those for you. I also like to use MetroMap. It covers 3 counties and offers some layers of information that you can't get on the others. And of course, there's also Google Maps. Some of you might have a plat map if you have a newer home that provides you the property boundaries and house information and such. So for example, we're looking on the right side, Portland Maps, and you can see the little place where you can input your address right there. And then what will come up is a page like this that is kind of split between property information and a base map of your property and a footprint of your house and garage or main structure. If you scroll down under this property information, there's in the list is assessor detail. And that's how I actually brought up this, the property information that actually gives you the dimensions of your property lines. So it saves some work for you. Up in this corner is an airplane, and you can toggle between base map and aerial photos. Over here is you can lose the property information and have your full screen show your home or your property in an aerial photo. And you can also enlarge that down here in this little scale will increase with that. So you actually have a way to sort of loosely scale off dimensions of your home. And in fact, you can snap a picture of it and print that out and with the scale, get some measurements that way. With some of the links that Andrew provided you, there's also some YouTube videos that help you get measurements off of the online maps that you can see. And over on your left here, I'm just showing an example of the contours that Metro Maps shows. And I will say that they also have in some of their layers, they show riparian areas, wetlands, floodplains, areas of slopes steeper than 10%, or greater than 25%. So it's very useful information to evaluate yourself, to play around with it. Once you kind of take that basic boundaries and home information and put those on a sheet of graph paper, and we suggest at quarter scale if it can fit. If you've got a larger property, maybe you need to go smaller and do 1/8 scale. And when I say that, I mean 1/8 equals 1/8 inch equals 1 foot, or 1/4 inch equals 1 foot. And the grid paper helps you size that. So measuring on the ground, what's really helpful if you have it is 100-foot landscape tape that you can lay down on the ground. I lay that down as a base map, or a baseline, excuse me, and then I measure off from that with a 25-foot tape. And that is the running measurement method that you see listed here. And you can see the yellow highlighted line is that 100-foot baseline tape. The diagram on top, you can see the kind of outline of the home. This is a front yard. And with this baseline, I'm picking up all of the measurements, the edge of the house and downspout, picking up the trunk of the shrub, and also you can do the outer dimensions of it, where the kind of dimensions of the house jog. We have the window dimensions listed here and a few more shrubs, and you can see that essentially what it is it's instead of measuring 2 feet and then 3 feet and 1 feet and 4 feet and a lot of little trying to add them all up. This is one continuous run that increases. And so when you want to transfer those measurements to a piece of paper, you're going to have the most accuracy doing it that way. The other way of measuring that we suggest that may come in handy or not is the offset measuring method, especially if you have some curvilinear lines or edges to your bed or your lawn and you want to keep, and you want to document that existing condition. So again, this might be a kind of a baseline down here, and you're just deciding on an interval that you want to use depending on the curve that you're measuring. And so each of these takeoffs or offsets are being marked, and then it's simply connecting the dots to kind of document that curve. And this comes in handy too. Let's say you've made your plan and now you want to move it out, to kind of mark that back on the ground to create some of the path lines or bed edges and curvilinear lines. You would use this to lay that design out on the ground. So these are some of the things that you want to pick up and note on your existing conditions base map. So, we talked about the house footprint, but also, note where those windows are, doorways, downspouts, anything that has some bearing on what you need to be considering and thinking about as you come up with a design and plan. And once you have those, fixed, sort of the house, the garage, the property lines, you can measure off of those to fill in the rest of the features in your yard that you want to pick up. Or you can use the baseline mesh method, as I said, kind of move that baseline around to pick up other features. Be sure to include all the hard surfaces and structures that you'll be keeping. That's the driveway, the sidewalk, porch, patio, if you have it, retaining walls, fences. In here you can note that we have a wood fence on one side and a chain link fence on the other side. In this example, that tells you something about visibility and screening and breezes. So this whole act of kind of documenting your existing conditions actually kind of blends very naturally into the observing and assessment exercise that you would be following this. So make sure you note where there's overhead and underground utility lines. You can, there's a free service to have utility lines marked. You can just dial, call 811, and just be sure to note all of the lines that you want located, because each company sends out their own service representative. And there's also a way to do this directly online. I believe OUNCE, O-U-N-C, Oregon Utility Locate Service is what you can use for that. So once you've done the measurements out on the ground, then you can come inside and add those to the base map that you've started. And this really gives you the plan, existing conditions of your plan that you're going to be designing and planning with. So I'm showing two examples here. One is sort of a hand-drawn example, if you're more comfortable with that. But also I've listed here several online landscape design software programs that you can avail yourself to if you prefer working that way. So, so the next step is to really understand your yard, your landscape is to the best of your abilities. And I think it's important to start with the soils. You may not know, but all soil in the United States has been identified and named and surveyed, and you can access that information for your specific area probably online at this point. They're all produced by, I believe, USGS, and they're called the county soil surveys. And what they're mapping is essentially the texture of your soil, which refers to the mineral portion. You see the little triangle diagram there, and you can see at each corner it could be all clay, all silt, or all sand. More than likely, your soil is some combination of those in between. So that's kind of a base beginning way to understand your soil. And in fact, I'm imagining that most of you have some sense of what your soil is like, and you can just do a field test even to get a sense of how clay it is. If you can be forming it into a shape, a ball or a snake or a ribbon, chances are you've got a pretty high clay content, and or you just know how slick and much it swells in the wintertime. And I've been in yards that are so dry in the summertime that there's cracks in the ground because clay has a high shrink swell character to it. Conversely, if it's a real sandy soil, it's going to be friable and gritty, and and fall apart if you tried to shape it into anything. So that's just the mineral portion, but really, and this little diagram in the upper right here is really important to know as it relates to gardens and plants. So we think of soil as a solid, but really the solid portion of the soil is 50%, and 50% of the soil should be air, space, and water in the soil. So I think most people don't think of it that way. And we also, of course, they've listed organic material at 5%, but depending on different settings and habitats in the forest, there's probably a lot more compost and organic matter in the soil. And what I find is you can keep adding that to the soil, because really it's the food for all the microorganisms that live in the soil. And with that kind of makeup, what you're going to see is a soil that is, it should be a lot less compacted. It almost has I like to use the analogy of a cake or bread, where you see all the air spaces and bubbles within it can tend to be a little crumbly in nature, kind of like the photo we have here in the lower left. So that's what we're striving for, and that really comes from adding and amending your soil with organic matter, and that's what creates the healthy structure for your plants. If you don't do that, you might have a soil that looks more like the soil in this lower left-hand picture, where you can actually see layers of soil. The upper layer that's darker is filled with more organic matter mixed in with the mineral portion. And once you get beneath that, it's probably mostly mineral and pretty hard and compacted. So you might, with this photo, I want to talk a little bit how you can test how well the water drains or percolates into your soil. So what we're looking at here is someone has dug a hole 1 foot deep. You fill it up once with water and let it drain. And then when that's fully drained, come back and fill it up again and use either a stake with a marker, or in this case, they've used a measuring tape. Mark and note where that water level is and leave it for 1 hour and come back and note again how far that water level has dropped. You could have soil where it's dropped 4 inches or 2 inches. And the fact of the matter is even if it's just a ½ inch drop, that gives you enough percolation or permeability to the soil to, say, build a rain garden if you were interested in collecting the rain from your rooftop and wanting to get it back down into the ground. You may also want to do soil testing. I think it's particularly relevant if you're growing food where you want to make sure you don't have any heavy metals present in the soil. And it can also measure all of the degrees of different nutrients, both macro and micro, and pH. Though pH is something that changes a lot, and it's a pretty easy thing to adjust. So it's really for you to decide how relevant it is to do this testing. It can be pretty spendy, especially if you want a full spectrum of nutrients measured. Probably next, most important to me anyway, is assessing the sun and shade patterns on your property. You know, every plant you look at and buy tells you its cultural requirements of sun and shade, and also water requirements. So when we talk about that, it's can be a little bit complicated, but just because we have so many different kinds of light happening in your yard, and it's shifting through the day as well as through the year. But through this, you really hopefully can identify your parts of your yard that are in full sun and or direct sun for a larger part of the day. For growing food, we say you should have at least 6 hours of direct sun to have a successful food growing garden. But you might have conditions that are more part shade, part sun, and I think actually a lot of natives are happy with that. So that might mean that it's under more dappled shade where it's getting some sunlight. We see the upper right photo where we see a deep shade situation, and you might find that under conifers as well. Good news is we have lots of native plants that can grow in a dry shade, which you often see under conifers. And then you have parts of your yard that may receive some nice morning sun and then shade in the afternoon, or vice versa, that late afternoon sun and not morning sun. So take some time to sort of map and note that. And just as an aside, I just wanted to add that there are kind of applications that help you figure sun and shade patterns through the year, or at least maybe through a growing season if that's important to you. I haven't used those myself. I have used them on a project where we were determining where to locate a large community garden in and amongst some fir trees, and it was a really helpful tool that located exactly where we needed to place the garden. So back to slopes and drainage. So here we are at the Metro map again, and you can see the contours. And first of all, I think it's, for me anyway, it's kind of nice to see how they show you the lay of the land. I can see that these are almost like here, little drainage areas on each, this side and this side of this property. And these contours are at 2-foot intervals. And the heavy line contour that you see marks every 10 feet. And you can see at the bottom of this map, again, we have the scale. So for instance, just looking at this, I can look at, say this 30 feet, looks like this would be, say, about 30 feet here. And I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 contours, or 12 feet of elevation change going on here. If I divided 12 vertical feet by the 30 horizontal feet, I can learn that that's about a 40% slope right there. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, I think, in the next slide. Yes. So these are a few ways that you can calculate the slope on the ground to get more specific or accurate. So with this diagram of house and a slope, we're just assuming someone is interested in planting a rain garden, or installing a rain garden here. And what they've done is put a stake on the uphill end of the slope and also at the downhill side. And important to note that this is a steady slope. If the slope changes, then you really want to measure each section. But this is a steady, continuous slope. And note that the string is wrapped tightly around one stake and then drawn to the second stake and drawn tight enough so that it's taut. And then this little gadget right here in the middle is called a line level. It has a bubble, just like bar levels. So once you know that's level, you can measure the vertical distance right here, which is 18 inches, and the horizontal length, also in inches. It's probably 9 feet something, but we want inches so you can do the math. And so what we're learning here is that if you divide 18 by 233, we get a slope that's 7.7%, which is that's a reasonable gentle slope, that good for installing a rain garden, nice for a pathway. In general, as a general rule, you don't really want pathways much steeper than 10-12% for any stretch. So you can see a few other methods that you can use. There's a small slope where we see this fellow measuring with a board and a bar level to essentially do the same thing. You can take your iPhone out and it will show you to compute that into a percentage slope, but that's a very informative as well. And then of course there's more sophisticated tools like a laser level that can show you differences between different elevation points. So often with the slope, you might find or notice some erosion issues. So really survey your ground and see what's happening. With the photo on the left, the first thing I notice is, this ground is, it's not covered with a protected mulch. And often what happens here is it will get compacted just simply from our winter rains, if not foot traffic over it. And if you've got compacted soils and it's on a slope, pretty soon you're going to see rivulets of rainwater flowing down it and probably some erosion and silt deposits. So, pay attention to these little signs here and there. The upper right photo here, you can see is quite a soggy area right at the downspout. I'm guessing that might be the case in this situation, is that the grades in this corner of the house are not flowing away from the house, and in fact flowing toward the house, so the rain only, the rainwater is accumulating right there. Or you might have erosion that's undermining some of your hardscape, as in this bottom slide here, that needs some correction. Another thing to notice and think about is the views. We just have two examples of, one is, here's someone's yard that happens to be next to a golf course. And of course they love that borrowed view and want to maintain it and or frame it. And at the same time, they're giving themselves a little privacy next to their outdoor cafe sitting area. So they can feel the protection of that while still enjoying the views. On the right hand, I think this side, I think this photo really shows pretty clearly the difference you can make by screening. No one ever, I don't think anyone would set a bench in the next to the fence in the before photo, but by providing some screening, you really created a nice spot for sitting and enjoying your garden. So along with this, I made mention before, but consider, it may be a factor, it may not, but consider the winds. You could have a strong prevailing wind, whereas this hedge or screen or hedgerow is also helping with that factor as well. In other cases, you might want to make sure that you're really encouraging keeping the summer breezes and not blocking those. Taking photos is another way to help you with your views and how you might think about them, as well as just noting details that can help you when you go inside. You want to begin playing with designing your yard, and it helps you visualize. So in this case, we're using, and some people just, it's hard to think two-dimensionally, and you really want to see it three-dimensionally. So in this case, we can look at the picture of the side yard, where you can see a fence that is perhaps 8 feet high, and we're seeing some buildings both 4 feet and higher above that. And so it lets you know right off the bat kind of how large of a plant you want for that, and can help you make selections that fit best for that. So let's talk about vegetation assessment. This might be a rather involving step for you in your yard, or maybe you have a yard that kind of suffers from being too much of a blank slate. But at either rate, one of the first things you should be looking for is, are there any invasive plants that need to be removed? Both the district and the backyard habitat program that we'll be talking about help you with identifying those invasive plants if you're not sure. And then I would just kind of look at what you have and notice what is that you love, either for its form or its flowers. It may have some sentimental value, or it just may be a great, you notice that it's a great habitat shrub or tree. So this is the vegetation that you want to keep and protect and add on to and build around. Also notice, you more than likely may have some neighbors' trees that are affecting your light or your views, or maybe they're dropping sap or seeds that want to start 100 little seed trees in your yard. So is there anything you can do with about that? Or if you can't, certainly let it help you decide where you want to put things, or where you don't want to locate, say, a dining area underneath, perhaps. And then look at the plants and notice if there's any that seem diseased or damaged. And overall, do you have a balance in your yard right now with evergreens and deciduous, so you can kind of keep that year-round interest? And if not, it lets you know that you probably may need some more evergreen plants in your yard to have some green through the winter. And along these lines, some more questions might be, do you have some problem plants that are too close to your foundation or hanging over your roof? Is it the plant too overgrown and too large for its space? Is it blocking entries or picture windows? You know, what can you do about that? You may want to remove it, but you could also attempt rejuvenating that plant, pruning it judiciously so that you can bring back a form that's more pleasant. In the bottom two slides, you can see that's been done with a Japanese maple, whereas the before picture is it's grown down to the ground. It's pretty dense. You don't see through it. It looks like a big hill. In the after picture, you can start to lift it up off the ground, and where you might even have some ground cover beneath it, and open it up, which is actually healthy for the tree to have more breezes coming through, and it helps prevent diseases from happening, and it's just more attractive. You might also notice that some of your plants, that especially the older ones, they just don't thrive in our climate anymore because it's gotten hotter and drier. And one example is a lot of the rhodies and azaleas that were so prolific in the Northwest have now succumbed to a lace bug infections that just take over them, and it's really hard to get rid of that. So these two examples kind of show all those observations and notes of both the problems and opportunities that begin to steer you or guide you in a methodical way toward creating the plan or design or vision. So don't want to spend too much time, but we can see that we have, areas identified for screening and some opportunity areas for possibly growing vegetables here, or a quiet spot in a corner. And these are a few more examples that we've created in Washington County with a couple homes. One is a small urban home and the other is a larger property. And you can see in both these cases existing conditions and some assessment, like in the case of the larger property, invasives to remove, both in terms of blackberries and or invasive trees, soggy lawn. So it starts to identify issues that you want to address. In the other map, we see also some opportunities for where a rain garden might be added, or where vegetable garden is best placed. So it's really fitting the site conditions with the features that you want to address. I'm going to stop and take a little break at this point. And if you have any questions with what I just went through, I'll take them now.
Great. So we did have one question come through, Laura, that I think would be great for this little break. So that question is, they're having trouble understanding offset measurement. Could you explain it again, please?
Okay. So let's assume you have a straight baseline tape. I wonder if should I flip back through it? Offset, I'll just try to describe it. Along a measuring tape that you're laying down on the ground, and I'll just assume that we have a curved edge of a lawn that you want to document so that you can put that in your existing conditions. So it's hard to measure curvilinear things. So with an offset method, you're laying a measure tape down, and then in the example I used, every 4 feet, I was measuring the distance from the tape to the edge of the lawn. So in some cases, it might be 4 feet. And if I go 4 feet more, it might be 5.5 feet. Or if I go 4 feet more, it might be, 6 feet, 10 inches. At any rate, you're measuring the distance from the tape to the edge of the lawn at some interval that you feel captures the curve adequately. So you're just kind of marking these dots of, and then connecting those dots, and that gives you the curve on paper that represents what you have on the ground, and vice versa. If you draw something that you want to create on paper, it helps you go out to the ground and use that offset measure to accurately duplicate the curves as you've drawn them on your paper. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, I do as well. I'm going to take one more question that's actually that I can answer, and then we'll get back to the presentation. So this person is going through the Backyard Habitat Certification Program, and they understand that the Tualatin SWCD may be able to provide some site analysis in addition to the initial site visit that Backyard Habitats provides. We absolutely can. And I'm going to touch base a little bit on that in an additional resource section at the very end of this presentation. But we are looking at holding what we're calling office hours with our urban conservation specialists that are going to be free consultations for folks who attend these workshops to sign up for, to get some of that technical advice. And from there, our conservation specialist is available to come out and actually do a site visit with you on your property. So it's something that we're trying. But I will hand it right back to you, Laura, and we can get back to the presentation.
All right, and I'm watching my time. Okay, so now you have a base map and a thorough understanding of your site, and I just encourage you to create a list for yourself that kind of adds up all of the things that you really want to accomplish, your vision, your goals and desires. And this could be, I've really kind of created a laundry list here of different features or elements to your yard that you want to make, that you might want to include. I won't run through all of them, but you can see, most everybody likes to maintain some bit of lawn for their children or dogs or games. And as well, I think everyone likes to have some outdoor dining, whether perhaps maybe covered, perhaps not, and a way to enjoy and being in the garden with sitting spots. So you get the idea. So once you kind of have the list of reminding you, this is what I want to create in my garden and what I want to accommodate in the garden, then the next step is really sort of a synthesis of how you bring it all together. And but before we get to that, I just want to add a few more points that I think it's important that you keep in mind your preferences. Some folks really like to spend a lot of time in the garden and others not so much, and that you should really factor that into the garden you create so you're not inadvertently creating a lot of maintenance. And also know what your aesthetic preferences are. Some folks really like things a little more neat and spacious, and I want to say that you can still do naturescaping and create habitat and have a look that looks more garden-esque, and as I say, or you may really want to use nature as your cue and create a garden that looks just like our natural areas next to us and have that feel. You may also have favorite seasons, favorite colors, and that's something you can think about when you decide on the plants that you want to include to bring you that fall color or certain colors of flowers if you like. And all of what you're doing in that design planning, ideally, is some of the problems that you see here can be turned into the solutions and opportunities that you want to capitalize on. Sorry about that. So, so this next step is really a diagram step, or concept design. We like to call it bubble diagramming. So you can see in these two examples, it's really a way just to organize all of those features and spaces and activities that you want to put in your yard, and you're doing it in such a way that it really fits with the site conditions assessment that you completed. For instance, in this one, we see the front yard, which is sunny, in the example on the left. They have a cut garden there, and also infiltration, it says, and clean runoff. That would be a rain garden that they're directing some of their roof water to. You can see that both sides are saying we need some privacy, which is also an opportunity for a wildlife hedge. In the example on the right, you can see how they've kind of done a general definition of areas and features. I see a couple of rain gardens, a little place for a bench. The whole back area is designated as an Oakland woodland garden. I like that they have the intention to add brush piles and down wood and some nest boxes in that area. In front there, it appears that their intention is to turn the lawn into a meadow and a place of bird bath there, close to the oak woodland garden behind. So from this step, then you can go to a more delineating illustration of it. But actually, what I've done here is shown just another example of bubble diagram that you can do with your online program, where they're choosing, again, just colors to designate some of the different features that you want to make sure to include in your yard. So here is the site design step after bubble diagramming, where you're just giving more delineation of shape and form. How much area do you want to include for your patio or your garden boxes or a sitting area, and the shape of your beds and your lawn. In the example on the right, they're even designating but not identifying specific genus species, but they're designating, we want a large deciduous tree in each of these corners, or an evergreen tree, small or tall shrubs in the background, or on the side where there's a slope on the east side, low evergreen shrubs that will go down the bank or the slope and stabilize it. So it's taking it one step further in giving clear delineation of the features and the paths and circulation. But the final step then would be to move to planting design. So I want to talk a little bit about that and just give you some tips or guidelines. And the first one, which is kind of almost a no-brainer, but really pay attention to right plant, right place. And that in effect means that you're grouping plants with similar light, soil, and water needs. And in fact, when you go out hiking and in nature, you'll start to see these plant associations or plant communities of plants that really like to be together because they appreciate the same conditions. And then just to reiterate, plant in, think in those planting layers. So you have some taller trees, if you can accommodate them in your yard, or small understory trees, large shrubs, right down to low shrubs and perennials and ground covers. And you can see from the diagram here that it really diversifies the habitat for these various species of birds that you want to attract to your yard. They tend to occupy these different zones of vertically of our forests. Also another kind of obvious point, just be sure to provide enough room for your plant's mature size. It seems obvious, and they tell you on the tags when you buy the plant, and you really do want to, take that to heart and give them enough room. And it doesn't mean that I think of some of these plants that you might buy as a little baby, but it's going to get to be 10 feet someday. And this is where ground covers kind of come in and help, that you can establish ground covers all around them, so you're not staring at bare ground while you're waiting for that plant to grow. And they may be a little slow the first year, but they usually leap by year 3, and you get to realize the size and scale of what you're hoping for. Another planting design tip is to group plant species in to create massings or swaths or drifts are different words we use for that. In effect, I'll just go to this little the lower left image. You can see that of any given species, they're all in abbreviation right now, but you see that they're planted in clusters of 3 or 5 or more or 9. And what that does is it creates these swaths or drifts of texture and color that make a garden more interesting aesthetically. But also biologically, what you're doing is creating a more massing that when birds or butterflies and hummingbirds are drawn to them, they're not trying to find one plant. They're really seeing a collection of plants and have more of a banquet to come to. And that's how you see it in nature as well. Again, a reminder to seek, if you don't have it, a balance of deciduous plants. I see 3 evergreens in the upper story on this lower example, and a low Oregon grape, the dark green symbol that you see there. And also on the ground cover, we have kinnikinnick and beach strawberry, the pink ground covers there. So they've got that included. And if you really want a low maintenance garden, stress a landscape that's mostly trees, shrubs, and ground covers. So I think first about, a plant's function. What are you trying to accomplish with it? So whether it be screening or creating a nice spot to sit or to frame a view, or maybe you don't want lawn, but you want some other ground cover that gives you that same kind of restful green effect. Of course, we keep coming back to the wildlife, food and shelter that you want to be sure you're providing with your plants. So that means giving some attention to bloom times and berry times, so you can hopefully kind of extend the period throughout the year as much as possible, that you have something to offer pollinators and birds. Plants are also really good at softening hard landscapes or trailing over stone walls, climbing a fence and a trellis, especially if you have narrow spaces on the sides of your house. I just want you to note that in this bottom right photo, this is actually an all-native evergreen screen that is made up of Pacific wax myrtle, tall Oregon grape, and a silk tassel tree, and they're sheared to create this hedge. So I know a lot of people ask for, are there any, I need a narrow, tall evergreen plant, and I'm happy to see this example that looks actually quite nice, that you can accomplish that with a native. So the next step is to actually then do a detailed planting design. In the image on your right, we saw that when it was more or less deciding where tall and medium shrubs would be and trees, and without identifying them. So this is the last step to actually go into the detail of deciding what each plant will be. And you can see they've handled it both by kind of symbolically showing different plants, but also by sort of flagging out the names of each of those clusters of plants. You could decide to do it with little symbolic forms of plants that represent different specific plants, as they've done in this colored photo on the left. Or again, back to this planting design that is provided by King County. You can look it up. They're using both a legend on the right that names the plants, and then in providing abbreviations that you then can name the plants that you want to put in your garden that way. So I like these images to show you the plant companions idea and how it's applied in your garden. So in the upper left, we see that's obviously a pretty shady garden that's probably on the dry side because it's under a fir. And we can see the layers there with the vine maple, um, um, probably about 10 feet tall, and about 5 feet tall we have some huckleberry, and covering the ground is Pacific water leaf. And the photo on the upper right shows quite a variety with vine maple and rhododendron, some of the a taller shrub. A little bit lower is snowberry and fern, and then at ground level we have a lot of redwood sorrel or oxalis, and you get the idea. You know, you may have areas as the bottom left, kind of it goes from shade to part shade. And when you get into the part shade, the more light you have, the more flowers and color you're going to be able to have. And you can see how they brought that in. And the lower right, we see the beautiful maidenhair fern. And the rest of the plants it's combined with are not native, but they're really, we have several shade-loving plants that are happy partners to our natives that you can blend in. And I like in all these cases, you see very few flowers, but how interesting it is with the different greens and textures and shapes of the leaves that we have. And in fact, we have a plethora of native ground covers that you can combine to kind of carpet the ground with. And again, notice all the different shapes and textures and colors of leaves. And yes, some little flowers to brighten it up here and there. So similarly, you want to kind of group those plants that love our sunny areas, and you're going to tend to see more perennial flowers, more grasses, perhaps in your sunny areas, but we also have many deciduous flowering shrubs, as noted here in the upper left photo. That is a red flowering currant, and beneath that is a 9-bark. And even though these shrubs a lot of them are really adaptable to different sunlight and shade conditions, you're going to have the most profuse display of blooms and berries when they can have more sun. And so that's just something to make note of. Just wanted to point out in the upper right, we can see a sunny garden bed, mostly perennials. We have some lupin in there, and lower corner of the photo is a red columbine, and the yellow flower is a monkey flower there. And bottom center, you're seeing lots of grasses being used that are really happy in our sunny areas. We have some native grasses and rushes and sedges, but honestly, a lot of ornamental grasses that blend well with our, in these conditions with our natives. And here are some of the plants that you might consider as an alternative to lawn if you still want something that covers, you know, a large area like a lawn and gives you that more restful look. So on the far right, it's actually a woolly thyme that's been used to replace the lawn, and it seems to work quite well. Beech strawberry loves the sun and is a really fast ground cover spreader, and it can make a nice effect. I've seen it hold up well on a slope, and of course you get the benefit of flowers and berries with that. And beneath that you can see succulent varieties. These are a combination of native and non-native sedums or succulents that you can choose to use. And then of course just a reminder that you can turn a portion of that lawn into a wildflower or pollinator meadow. So we want to throw this in to show you at least one of the methods that we encourage for removing lawn. So you don't have to use spray to kill the grass and a tiller to till it all up, which is actually disruptive to the soil microbial life. So this is called sheet mulching, and you can see how cardboard is laid down This was a field that we turned into a community garden. So it was a work party with 100 volunteers because it was pretty large scale. But you lay the cardboard down first, and it's good to wet it. And what it's doing over time is decomposing the lawn beneath or field grasses beneath it. And then on top, you're placing organic material, which typically, which we have an abundance of, is bark chips or bark mulch and all the fall leaves. And those were piled up to about 8 inches thick. And then you just wait. Best time to do this is in the fall before the rains. And so you have all those months of the winter rains and spring for that to break down and decompose and begin to build a healthy organic soil for your garden beds or vegetable garden, if that's what you're seeking to do. So we've talked a lot about plants, but these next series of slides are really to provide you just it's a little visual tour of some of the other features and elements that you'll be bringing into your yard. So, of course, the plants are there for berries and pollinator, pollen and nectar for our insects and birds, and shelter. But other things you might add to that is a bird bath, of course, but in the upper left here, we see a bird bath that's made into a mud bath, which is actually a way to that butterflies use to drink water. You might want to be providing these are a couple versions of mason bee boxes. They will use these cavities to the mason bee will lay an egg in there, and in these cavities, along with a food source, and the larva will hatch, eat the food source, and eventually hatch out of that. After they go through their cycle from egg to larva to pupa, and then emerge in the spring as a mason bee. And what's nice about it's a native bee. We have a couple hundred varieties of them. They're solitary bees, not hive bees, so they do not sting. And most importantly, they are active much earlier in the season than honeybees are, which are not native, are really from the Mediterranean. Other habitat features you might include are some rock piles or brush piles, any form of decaying wood, whether it be a snag or downed wood on the ground, provides perches, it provides cavities for feeding and or nesting. And the wood that's down in the ground, as it's decaying, you have a whole variety of beneficial insects that help with that decay process, and they in turn are the food for birds. And just a little idea on the lower right side, it's called a hibernaculum, where you can use stone and rock, and looks like they have some concrete blocks there and logs, and essentially it's making a place in the ground with a lot of cavities, and this is it's inviting this is where snakes might hibernate or shelter themselves. And of course, on the left is just a view of a habitat hedgerow shelter. The idea being is that you keep it dense, so it really is a place that birds can get away and hide from any predators. Pathways should be a part of your yard and garden to enjoy it and make maintenance easy. And these are just a lot of examples of how you might want to create a path. The top two photos on the left are a little more formal with formal edging, and you may want that for a primary path between maybe to your deck or patio. But in other areas of your garden, you can be more informal just by placing, bark chips. I like to use cedar because they're more rot resistant and will last longer, or stepping stones. We see in a few cases here. Some are in the soil, some are in the lawn, some are in a bed of gravel. We've even seen, sorry, I have that view. Hopefully you're not seeing that. We've even seen recycled concrete used as flagstone steppers. In the lower right corner, we want to give this, show you this idea of a way you can minimize the pavement of your driveway. This was used quite a lot in the past. They were called Hollywood driveways, but it's simply removing the concrete between the two tire paths and putting plants down there, and the concrete that is remaining the water can run off from the concrete into that island of green in the middle. In this case, we have thymes and succulents that are used. These series of slides show you different versions of rain gardens and ways to capture or treat the rainfall. You can see, I like seeing the different styles here to suit your taste. Some are very flowery, that would be in the sun. Another garden here is very minimalist in terms of planting. It has sufficient drainage without the plant, and it really becomes a little pond feature. And on the right, upper right, we have a garden that's it's very simple, very low maintenance. It's primarily sedges and rushes, a red twig dogwood variety in the background, a strawberry tree. In the lower left, this was a yard and a lawn that received a lot of water from surrounding properties that were higher, and it really had a problem of a mushy, wet lawn for too much of the year. So in this case, we actually installed a French drain beneath what you see is the river rock or drain rock cobbles there. So it picks up the water that's coming onto the site and conveys it down to the lowest corner of the property where we have a rain garden, collects all that and makes the lawn much more functional and enjoyable. In the middle slide on the bottom, you can see another sort of river rock swell. Really gives a nice effect of a dry stream bed, but at the same time, it has a functional purpose of conveying some of the water from your downspout down into the garden. And then finally, you might be interested in collecting or harvesting some of the rainfall off your roof. And we suggest in this case, if you do that, because of our season being 8 months of rain and then 3.5 months of no rain, you really need to be looking at a larger system like this cistern to collect that water. So as I've said before, the three elements of wildlife habitat are food, shelter, and water. And I would look for opportunities to include water source around your garden or yard for all of the wildlife that visit it. So the top row pictures are simpler forms of providing water. These days, there are a lot of landscape supply places that actually have created rocks that have a natural little basin in them. So when it rains, they fill up with water and become a bird bath. The next photo over is a bird bath. And notice that it's filled with various rocks and shells. And the idea behind this is that you're creating different water depths. So it's inviting not just to birds, but also the bees and butterflies that might want to visit and lap at some water. So a simple bird bath is fine. You want to make sure in the summertime to refresh it every few days. But if you can introduce a little moving water, recirculating that babbles or trickles, that actually is a cue to the birds. They're used to hearing creeks and brooks, and it might draw more. And it also keeps the water fresh to have that recirculating system. And the bottom is just a little bit of inspiration to take that water idea. And again, I like the photo on the bottom left. It's really mimicking nature in terms of cascading water through that we see in some of our smaller streams. Or you can create a little, as this one gardener has in the backyard program, a little miniature pond to enjoy. And we find that a lot of the folks that are interested in doing naturescaping in their yard also like to grow food. And I think these two goals work together really nicely. And I just want to say that when you're growing food here in the Northwest, we tend to have a more temperate climate and limited number of days of hot and sun, though that seems to be changing. But essentially, growing here in the Northwest, it really helps to build your vegetable gardens with some type of raised bed system, whether it be rock or wood. You're going to find that you have better drainage that way, and importantly, the soils will warm up sooner in the season and give you a longer season. Of course, in this upper right photo, we can see that they've added hoops to their boxes so they can even create a greenhouse through the winter and grow some of the hardier vegetables all year round. On the bottom, you can see that we have a couple types of trellis systems to grow berries and or espaliered trees that you can incorporate even in small spaces in your yard. And then I just like to include this compost system. It's a 3-bin system, and it has a cover on it, and each of those boards move, so it really is easy to use in terms of having compost at different stages and being able to harvest and or turn it easily. And I think it's a nice addition to your garden if you do want to vegetable garden or just have flower gardens. Any of the garden waste is really a resource that kind of completes the circle of recycling the nutrients back into the ground. So I'm going to stop here. I know we have a few additional resources to share with you for next steps. And I think, Andrew, you're going to talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for handing it off. That was a great presentation. It's always fantastic to see those features in an actual landscape. You know, it really inspires ideas, isn't it?
That's the idea.
Right. Awesome. So if you wouldn't mind just switching over to the next slide, I'm going to highlight a few additional resources that are available for everyone as you're undertaking a naturescaping project. So the first one I want to highlight is the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District's Urban Conservation Program. So we actually have an entire program that is devoted to helping Washington County residents complete naturescaping projects within their community. And that's our Urban Conservation Program. That program helps provide technical advice from anything from rain garden installation to advice on what wildlife habitat features you might want to incorporate, to helping you plan a community garden with a group in your local community. We're piloting a new program that we're calling our office hours with our conservation specialists. These are free 30-minute consultations that are done virtually with our specialists that you can talk a little bit more in depth about the landscape that you're working with. And they're a great way to kind of kick off any sort of naturescaping project that you're undertaking. In the follow-up email that I'll be sending to everyone at the end of this week, or by the end of this week, there'll be a link where you can actually go ahead and schedule that. We're, depending on interest, we're hoping to hold those consultations over the next 3 months of November, December, and January, and you'll be very easily able to sign up for those with that meeting link. Additionally, our specialist is more than happy to come out and schedule a site visit to your location, and you can talk really in depth about some of the things that you're facing. I also want to highlight a few of the financial assistance programs that we have available at the Tualatin SWCD. Currently, our grant program and our cost share programs are on pause until we have a little bit better financial understanding for new entries to come in. But we are still working with folks to get their plans ready. So with the hopes that we'll be able to start accepting new applications come January the 1st. Next slide, please. Additionally, I want to highlight the Backyard Habitat Certification Program. And if anyone out there is familiar with backyard habitats, you know of what a fantastic program it is. And we're working very closely with Backyard Habitats to expand further into Washington County. 2 years ago was the first year that was offered for residents of Washington County. And this last year, it further expanded out to encompass everyone that lives within urban Washington County. Now that program is set up to help urban gardeners establish backyard habitats that really help support the wildlife throughout our area. When you sign up for that program, you can be certified at 3 different levels according to 5 different criteria. You can see those criteria on the screen here. And as you can tell, they're very similar to many of the principles that we've been talking about today in our Naturescaping program. So if you have a chance, I very much encourage you to check out backyardhabitats.org, and there will be a link to that website in that follow-up email that you'll be soon receiving. Next slide, please. And finally, this is our contact information. We'll be sending out a copy of these presentation slides, so you will have that. You'll also have my direct email. So if you have any questions about anything that we've spoken about today, or any of the programs that we offer, please feel free to reach on out. I'm just an email away, and I'm more than happy to connect you with any resources that we might have that might be able to assist you. And with that, I believe we can head into our Q&A session. So if you want to go ahead and add any questions that you might have into that Q&A box, we'll go ahead and get started with a couple of questions that were submitted prior to the webinar tonight, and then we can just go ahead and start looking at the questions as they come in. So the first question for you, Laura, is this person has multiple Douglas firs lining the entire south side of their yard. Their dry shade limits many of the prettiest blooming plants from flourishing. Creeping Mahonia, oxalis are surviving but not spreading. Do you have any plant suggestions for this challenging situation?
Yes, I have a few.
Start.
Well, I think what you mentioned, oxalis and the creeping Mahonia, which is Mahonia repens. The low Mahonia nervosa, is very good as well. And I remember doing a hike on the backside of Powell Butte and just seeing how beautiful that understory of Doug fir was, with just the low Oregon grape and of course sword fern. It's one of our toughest plants, and I love it. It's a great size, it's evergreen, and it seems to thrive both from sun to shade. So it's definitely one to include in the understory of a fir. I might ask too, what's happening? Do you have a pretty, is there a pretty good duff layer? Is there a good permeability and a lot of, kind of decomposed needles and or leaves or compost? So that's all going to help kind of hold some water in the soil a little bit longer. And let's see, another ground cover that seems to do pretty well that I've witnessed in the shade is the bleeding heart, and also snowberry, which is a shrub that will get anywhere from 3 to 5 feet high. I've worked on a lot of restoration projects that are larger scale, and it always seems to be the one species that succeeds better than others do. And again, it seems to have a range from shade to sun. Oh, and another one that I've had in my own yard under a big conifer tree is thimbleberry. It does all right in shade, and it does all right with sun or with little water. So that's what I can think of just offhand.
There's some great options. No, absolutely. It's a good place to start at the very least. We had another question submitted prior to the webinar. Um, they like to use a homemade compost from food scraps using the free garden earth round bins. But seeds never seem to break down and tend to sprout when they use that compost on bedding or vegetable plants. How can they improve the compost product so that they can use it to naturescaping clay soils?
Okay, good, excellent question. So, well, first off, I want to say that if you have any weeds like crabgrass, or certainly any of the invasives like herb robert that have prolific seeds, you really want to keep all of those weed seeds and invasive plants out of your home compost. That compost pile is just, it's too small to reach the hot temperatures that that they get at the municipalities that are making compost for you, and they are businesses that have to guarantee that their compost is killing disease pathogens and weed seeds. So, but then what they're losing is all the wonderful living microorganisms that you can that you will have in your home compost pile. So there's sort of pros and cons of each, and it's just good to know that. So I keep a compost pile, and I put all my leaves and grass clippings in it and garden scraps, but I'm really judicious about what I include in that. So yes, you may find that, what is it, tomatoes in particular, their seeds, for those seeds to germinate, they actually like being scarified or rotting a little bit to crack the seed coat, and you will see some tomato seedlings coming up, but hopefully, those aren't problematic. So I just applaud you for having a compost pile and just be judicious about what you put into it. I've actually, in my past yard, I actually took grass clippings from a neighbor and would collect bags of leaves when they would show up down on the street. And a good thing to think about is how you really have a nice proportion of those greens and browns, your carbon and nitrogen, to have a healthy compost pile. So if it's just a pile of say grass clippings, for instance, you've probably seen how that happens. It gets really slimy and smelly, and so it's the carbon or the brown portion with dry leaves, or if you don't have them available, maybe you do have straw or pine shavings or something else that you can mix in to keep a balance. That's why I actually sort of have stations next to my compost pile if I need to, so I can add something else to the wet of the kitchen garbage to keep that balance.
Nice.
So,
That's great. A question from tonight. Do you know how often that Metro Maps revises their maps, especially if the property has been regraded?
I don't. I'm trying to think if I know Portland Maps, it shows, I've looked at it, and it actually had 2019 flyovers. And actually the answer to that is it really ranges depending on where you're located. Because I've gone and tried to look at properties more that are more rural, and I think they just are, they're probably not as frequently flown over.
Which
So
would
just
make sense.
check in. I don't know who could answer that question for you either.
I don't. I'm sure Metro Maps probably has some sort of contact us on their main website, so it might be worth reaching on out to them.
Yeah,
And we
the
can look
Data
into it as
Resource
well.
Center at Metro, who you'd want to contact to find out.
Yeah, there you go. All right, another question from this evening. Is it better to remove large nuisance trees completely or attempt to turn them into wildlife snags?
Interesting. The answer is it all depends, right?
Yeah, like
Um,
everything.
yeah. Well, let me think about that. What would be the answer to move completely? Well, a tree of heaven is a very invasive tree. And I'm thinking that is probably one you want to remove completely, because I don't even think you could accomplish making a snag out of it, because it will probably continue to sprout and sucker. And if it isn't dead, it's going to keep wanting to grow. So, so I'd advise that one to be moved completely. But wherever you, if you have I mean, a snag technically is a tree that has died or is, is decaying and dying. So, um, um, so in that case, you wouldn't have that problem. It's really already ongoing in its process of decay. That's going to provide you the benefits that we talked about earlier. So I don't know if this person is thinking of removing a live tree and keeping some of it. I've certainly seen that happen, especially with our conifers. So it still has the benefit of that trunk and all of the little creatures that are in the bark, and maybe a few branches for perching. So I think if there's, good reasons to remove that tree. I know in some cases conifers have been grown too closely together, and so that they're not able to have a nice structure and actually are more prone to wind blow down. And so people might thin out a grove for that reason, give more room to the ones that are remaining. And I would say in that case, try it. Although you've got a lot of trees around, so maybe you don't need this snake.
Yeah, and the other thing that
Just
I've
here.
yeah, when
Yeah.
I've put on previous wildlife habitat webinars, especially when it's dealing with snags, it's always best to consult with an arborist as well. Just because since it
Yeah,
is a
good
dead
point.
tree, you don't know exactly what the structure is. And oftentimes those arborists can still keep dead trees and cut them in a way that they can be freestanding and actually make really great habitat. So
That's a really good
um,
point. Thanks.
no, absolutely. But again, you pointed out something that was good as well, is think about what type of tree that you have. If it's a tree of heaven that is an invasive species, that might be one that you might consider taking out. Just like you said earlier, it just depends.
Mhm. Yeah,
Um,
in that case, you probably need to grind the stump out as well to make sure it doesn't come back.
yes, absolutely. Another question from this evening, is it safe to assume that a sun map of their site is best done throughout the summer months? Would it be worth doing it now?
Oh, well, really the best is if you've had a year at a place and you can see it through the seasons and you've
Mhm.
made notes of where that sun and shade is. So, um, or maybe you just kind of know from your own experience, you know your yard. I I think it should work in the reverse. It's like if you're already seeing, that our sun's, I forget what angle in the sky is now. It's going to get lower,
Mhm.
but yeah, it would be interesting to see where it is now and how that would translate to what it would project for how, the high of summer or the depths of winter. I think it should work.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And, talk with your neighbors, especially with folks who've been there a while. They might be able to point out a few things for you.
Mhm. One thing I want you to note with that is, like, I don't want it to feel like this, like it has to be mapped out with excruciating detail. But the fact of the matter is a lot of the natives that I teach about, they have this adaptability range of, like, yes, I can handle shade, and I can handle, you know, part sun and part shade, or even more into the sun. And they adapt. What happens is they change their form. I like to use the vine maple as an example. It's like in the sun, it tends to be more very much a multi-trunked tree or shrub, and it's denser, and it gets, you know, bright fall color. And then you take that same tree and you see it growing in a shady place, and it's going to be a little more leggy and sparse, because this tree is competing, you know, with the firs around it for sunlight. And so it's stretching. That's why they call it the vine maple, for some light. And so it's not going to be as thick or dense. And in the fall, it might turn yellow at most. But it's just a condition of how it adapts to its little micro setting or climate that it's in. And so with natives are, I'd say, mostly forgiving.
Plants are adaptable for the most part.
Yeah.
Great. Another question from this evening. Do you have any recommendations for deterring deer from eating your plants?
Oh, all I can say, because I can't come up with them right off the top of my head, but I know that if you go to OSU Extension, they have all kinds of publications that address that. Our nurseries, at least Portland Nursery, they developed lists. So just Google online, and you're going to find so many resources that will come up with plant lists that are more deer proof. The other, actually, I want to add this, this one notion, because I know people try to do big fences to protect their garden, and you know, that deer can't leap over. And I had this one permaculture instructor who lived, I think he was outside of Ashland, or definitely on a rural property. And he surrounded his property not so much with something tall as a whole sort of barrier of native shrubs, of rose bushes and other shrubs, that it's like it's wide enough that, first of all, on the outside, it's providing some forage for the deer, but it's also something that they won't leap over. So that on a larger property scale, that was how he created protection for his inner yard.
It's a smart way of doing it. That makes it, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Another question from this night that probably is relatively similar to that last one. This person lives in an area that's at risk for wildfires. Do you have any suggestions on resources that both meet the desire for landscaping and having necessary defensible space?
This is an excellent question, and I think we're going to be spending a lot more time with this.
Well, and what I can say too, if we, since we are running a little late, OSU has a great resource for fire-resistant plants, and I will make sure to include that in the follow-up email that does highlight a lot of fire-resistant plants that you can incorporate into a landscape, and many of those will have very similar features, and many of them are native plants that can be incorporated to any naturescaping project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I look at some of the goals that we're trying to achieve with naturescaping, and that look, and it's like, how does that line up with, you know, kind of defensibility of fires? And I think I definitely want to spend more time with that. It's a great question, but I know that the resources are out there, and especially, you know, California has a lot more time dealing with this, and I'm sure there's resources that can come to us from that direction as well.
Yeah, we'll make sure to include some of those in that follow-up email that I'll be sending out.
Yeah.
Another question from this evening. They're in the process of removing about 800 square feet of English ivy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. That's a big project.
Yeah.
They're digging out the roots right now. Do you have any suggestions on where to go from there? Solarize it to kill it all off, plant a cover crop to improve soil quality, and then turn it under, and then dig up any ivy sprouts that come up, deep mulching, any other tips that you might have?
Those all sound good. Is this on a slope or is it flat?
They did not mention.
Okay. I would think, I guess my first,
It's a flat area too,
yeah,
just so.
first, I would try with the deep mulching to see what that would do, because it's number one, it's protecting the soil. Number two, it is breaking down. And one thing that we found when ivy has been removed is that somehow down in the ground there seems to be a lot of surprises and seed banks of natives that will then come and return now that the ivy's been removed. So I'm a little hesitant to do the solarizing treatment because of that. And it might be that, of course, you're not going to get every root of the ivy, but in my own experience, I've found when I've done a clearing like that, and just stay a little bit vigilant and always observe and monitor that anything that might poke up with the ivy here and there, that I can usually nip it in the bud. But that's just my experience with it, and I don't have a personal experience with a kind of a large scale ivy removal like that. So I might allow that. There's another approach, but I feel pretty confident in approaching it the way I
That
would.
makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So another question that we have, this person has 3 acres that's been designated as an erosion zone and an aquifer recharge area. It has also been used as a hayfield for many years. Is there an order of planting that's best to implement bringing this ground to a more natural state, or should they just kind of go by planting in whatever particular zone that they're in?
So it's a hayfield right now, essentially.
It sounds like it was previously used as a hayfield for many years, but they're trying to change it back into a more natural area.
Mm-hmm. Boy, I know that Metro has, in terms of their open space acquisitions, have inherited that situation quite a bit, turning a hayfield or some other crop into a natural meadow. In fact, well, I won't go there, excuse me. I was thinking of a particular one, but I think first and foremost is if within that you do have some invasive species to focus on them. There might be, I could imagine that there could be the invasive thistle growing amongst that. And this is probably a case, and correct me if you will, you probably have your several rural technicians that can guide this actually. What was I going to say? That, in some of these cases, it might actually take some judicious use of chemical pesticide to knock specific invasives out on a larger scale, just to get ahead of them. And at the same time, I mean, I don't know if the intent is to keep the meadow open or to begin to populate it with some trees and shrubs, and that right there sort of changes the conditions beneath it. That will then, once you start to establish more shade, that changes the microclimate and creates conditions for other shrubs and plants to be growing within that. I know we took that approach for a wetland that had just almost a monoculture of reed canary grass, and we were trying to establish trees within that would create more shade, that would favor a different variety of plants than the reed canary grass.
Yeah.
But it's a longer, it's really a longer term stewardship project to do that. Yeah. but it certainly, I know that it's been done. And again, I hope that, I imagine that your technicians can offer some guidance on that front.
Yeah, exactly what I was going to mention. If this person is interested, I'm more than happy to connect them with our habitat restoration team, who really focuses a lot in kind of that stream zone. And I'm sure they'll be able to provide some really great technical assistance to help guide your planning. So if you just want to respond to that follow-up email that I'll be sending out, I'm more than happy to connect you with our habitat restoration team. Another question that's actually for me: do we offer a whole session on composting? Right now we don't, unfortunately, but another local SWCD, the West Multnomah SWCD, they have an entire soil school that they normally hold.
Right.
Last year's event was supposed to be in April. They had to cancel it because of COVID. I haven't heard if it's going to be in a virtual format yet, or if they're gonna, what the plan is gonna be for that for next year. But if you just kind of keep your eyes and ears open to West Multnomah SWCD, they will be able to provide you a way better experience in any sort of soil management than we can in just a single session like this. And their workshops in that soil school is absolutely fantastic. It's highly recommended. Another question: are there any natives that don't like oak leaves as much? They've borrowed some leaves from a neighbor.
I don't believe so. In fact, a oak leaf mold is sort of touted as like, that's gold to us. We really love that as a mulch, and I really don't think there's it doesn't have any sort of allelopathic is the term they use, say, like walnut trees are famous for that they have these properties that actually prevent other plants from growing beneath them. And so, that is problematic, but everything that I know about oak leaves is they're very desirable, and I wouldn't hesitate to actually, the one concern you do want to have, if you're thinking, are you thinking if this person is just thinking of them as a compost or a mulch, fine. But if you're gardening under an oak tree, they are more sensitive than most trees to kind of digging and disruption of the soil with under their canopy. So you want to be consider that and probably basically try to use lower growing, shallower rooted plants and ground covers beneath them.
Great advice. Another question that we have: with cardboard in terms of sheet mulching, does it need to be free of printing? They know that it shouldn't have any shiny coatings, but they've heard that purists insist that there should be zero printing, and that material is unfortunately less readily available, at least for free.
Yeah, I used to have a great source, every permaculturalist did, where they would go to the breweries, the back dock, and they would just fill your tractor car with those nice big 5x5 squares of cardboard. But now so many of these institutions have sort of a closed loop system of sending it off. And so we have to scramble a little bit more. I routinely go to appliance stores or bike shops, where it's almost on a kind of a relationship basis that you establish your connection. And it's like one refrigerator box can cover a lot of ground. So I would try to go that route. Yes, there's purists. I just don't see the problem. I know that a lot of these inks are soy inks, and they're just not an issue. Yeah, with boxes, if they've got that glossy finish, or certainly, a lot of them come with tape and staples, and you don't want that.
Mm-hmm.
The other reason I advocate going for the bigger sizes is because you really don't want little, what shall I say, spaces in between the cardboard, a crack here, in between this flap and that flap, because wherever there is, those weeds are going to find their way up through that. So you really want to overlap those separate pieces, and the bigger sort of constant, piece that you have, the less issue you're going to have with some of those weeds and grasses finding their way up and through. So.
Yeah, I can attest to that. I'm in the process of doing a pretty large scale sheet mulching project on my property, and everywhere where there's a little gap, I have grass still popping up. So I go through almost on a weekly basis and pull up grass.
Yeah.
So the larger the cardboard that you can have, the better.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just a final comment, they thank you very much for the presentation. They've heard that using Irish soap and baby socks hanging from some fruit trees is a good way of holding off deer. I had not heard of that, but want to throw that out there to the group if that might be of some help. It might just be folklore, but who's to say?
Yeah, some folklore is good.
Exactly.
I do not, yes, I do not. I can't confirm or deny.
And that's okay sometimes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all to everyone who's joined us through the end of this presentation. As I mentioned, I will be sending out a follow-up email in the coming days that will have all of our presentation slides, as well as a link to the recording of this webinar, in case you need to go back and see some of the slides or wanted to hear another section of it again, as well as a nice list of resources that can help you along your way in completing your naturescaping project. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope you all have a great evening.
All right.